Welcome to today's discussion. Today is the 18th of December, 2024, and I'm joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Good to see you again, Colonel.
Good to see you, Glenn.
So I really wanted to focus today on somewhat dramatic developments in both Ukraine and Israel/Palestine, as it appears that Washington, to some extent, has lost some control over the direction of the wars and the ability or the possibility of them actually spreading. Uh, so I know, yeah, you've commented before that you're not very pleased with the amount of military responsibility or Washington's taking on at the moment. But I thought we could maybe start with the developments in Ukraine, because it appears that some of the optimism has disappeared, and now even the media are starting to come to terms with how dire the situation actually is. How would you define or characterize the current state of the war?
I would think that in any normal setting, historically in Europe, this war would have ended a long time ago. But it continues because the ruling class of the West, the so-called neocon globalists, sometimes I add Trotskyites to it since they seem to be intent on this regime change everywhere, want to fight this until there are no Ukrainians left. And that is not an exaggeration. And this is not simply a battlefield issue. What's striking to me is that the G7 right now, obviously under our pressure and leadership, if you want to call it that, is trying to find ways to confiscate Russian funds, which, in my judgment, is an act of war against Russia. Although I think you could argue to this point that we've made so many uh, attempts to provoke Russia into a major war, it's hardly worth counting any longer. So the reason we're sitting here and talking about where is this war really headed is simply because Vladimir Putin has refused consistently to take the bait. Every time he's been pushed into a corner, every time he's been attacked publicly or verbally, every time we attack them through the financial system with economic sanctions, as well as with our military power through the Ukrainians, he's held back. And much to the consternation, obviously, of many of his advisors, but I think it's paid off handsomely because he's weakened us to the point where, frankly, I don't think NATO presents much of a threat whatsoever to Russia. And despite the attempts to frame Russia as this uh, great power with an insatiable appetite for conquest and territorial control, there's no evidence for it. None. The Russians could have moved offensively to the west, I would think, anytime since probably the beginning of March, or even earlier, but certainly for weather reasons, March and April would have been better. They haven't done it because very clearly Putin does not want to put Moscow in the position of having to referee and manage Eastern Europe. Far from it. He simply wants to retain control of those areas that are Russian. And as he said over and over and over again, historically Russian. And he's right. And that means Odessa all the way to Kharkov, essentially in this sort of banana form that you have in the eastern and southeastern parts of the contemporary Ukraine. And I think he's waiting for someone to step forward and take ownership of the disaster in Kiev. We certainly will not do it. We never do. Normally, when things go badly for us, we simply pack up our bags, get on our airplanes, get on ships, and leave. But we don't take responsibility for any of the damage that we've done. Europeans need to understand this, and I don't think they get it. They still don't understand that we do not live in Europe. And I would not want, as a European, to pin my hopes forever on a power that is thousands of miles away with a whole set of interests that are mercurial. And when I say mercurial, I mean it. We do have real strategic interests, we Americans. Most of those are in the Western Hemisphere, and those are the ones we are ignoring. It's interesting that the same class that wants to make war against Russia is responsible for flooding Europe with millions of unwanted people from the Near East and North Africa, and in the United States with people from Latin America, as well as people from Africa, the Near East, all over the world, people that we can't employ, people we cannot afford to sustain. people that are contributing to the breakdown in the rule of law inside the United States. So it's a very strange juxtaposition. On the one hand, we have this relentless war in eastern Ukraine that we are pushing hard when it makes absolutely no sense to do so, and there's no evidence for any of the assertions we made about Russia. And at the same time, we're ignoring our own security in the Western Hemisphere. I think you have a similar situation. I hope the Europeans will come to their senses as soon as possible and step forward and take ownership of the disaster for no other reason, because it needs to end if there is to be any Ukraine at all.
Yeah, well, you allude to this duality of the way Russia's referred to in the Western media, because either it's almost collapsing or it's about to conquer the world. So it's always not either or, but sometimes it's both of these extremes at the same time. So it appears to have overcome this period of Russia is hopelessly backwards and failing, and now we're speaking of whether or not Russia will conquer all of Ukraine and then go after NATO. So it's again, we dialed it to the other end now, but it doesn't seem that Europe is wanting to bring this to an end, because the rhetoric from Germany now suggests that if the United States is not going to send more weapons, then they have to increase it. And I hear the same rhetoric from other European countries as well. So I'm not sure if that's possible to replace the United States militarily, but I was curious how you see the fronts are shifting now, because after this failed offensive by the Ukrainians since the summer, the Russians obviously has gone on the offensive now, and one is getting pretty bad news coming out of Ukraine as well from the political and military leadership, in which they're suggesting cracks are emerging, and Russia's responding obviously to this. I was just wondering how do you see the front lines moving in the time to come, or what do you think the Russians will do? Do you think they're going to open a new front in Sumy or Kharkov, or do you see anything of the sorts?
Well, Moscow has made it clear they want the demilitarization of Ukraine, period. They want the so-called denazification of Ukraine, which I always thought was an interesting view, because I see it as being deglobalized, if you will, and Ukraine as opposed to denazifying. I think most of the silly nonsense with Nazi symbols is limited to a small number, but nevertheless a menacing number. And then finally, he's made it very clear that after demilitarization and denazification, that he will not accept a Ukraine that is anything other than neutral. So these are, I think, eminently reasonable objectives, all of which can be attained. Now, we have obstructed Russia on all counts, but frankly, let's be honest, we're not in a position militarily to obstruct much longer, if we ever were to begin with. In other words, NATO has exhausted its military capacity, in my judgment. I see no evidence for Norwegians, Spaniards, Frenchmen, Germans, Greeks, or Poles all lining up to march east in the Great Crusade to quote unquote save Ukraine. I don't see much interest in Ukraine at all, other than keeping it out of the EU under certain circumstances because of the competitiveness of Ukrainian agriculture. But setting all of that aside, I think the Russians are moving cautiously but deliberately forward. I don't think they want to absorb any of the Ukrainian population if they can avoid it. Everybody sort of looks at me strangely when the United States, and I say this, and I said, but the Russians really don't want to rule Ukrainians. And if you look at most of these areas that we're talking about right now that the Russians already control, they're Russian, filled with Russians, people that speak Russian. We used to say, well, Ukrainian citizens speak Russian. All right, fine. They're Russians. Kharkov is one of those. Odessa has always been a Russian-speaking city, so is Kharkov. So until those are taken, this is not over. I think he would rather sit down at the negotiating table and come to a solution that would give Russia what it wants ultimately, and no one will step forward to do that, with the exception of some isolated figures that we don't hear a great deal about in the Russian or the Ukrainian military. Now, this man Arestovich, who headed Ukrainian intelligence, I guess, is now stepped forward and made some comments that are leading people to believe that he might be able to step into the vacuum. The problem right now for Russia and for us and for the East, for the rest of Europe, is that most of the people at the top are all corrupt. They are sort of smothered in corruption. People come to me all the time, well, don't you think Zelensky is a good general and everything else? Well, I can't really evaluate that based on performance. I'd say no, a pretty bad general. Well, don't you think he could replace Zelensky? Really? Where's the evidence for that? Is he less corrupt? Has he got a different worldview that's going to put an end to this conflict? This is the problem. The West is looking for someone else to step in and replace Zelensky, but Zelensky, getting rid of him, of course, is a very positive development. Don't get me wrong, but that's not the only problem. And in the meantime, we've done something that the old Soviet uh, imperial establishment used to do. We've extended citizenship to someone like Zelensky and told him that he can come live in the United States and he'll be protected by security and perpetuity because he's been a loyal servant of the greater American empire. I find that detestable, distasteful, but I think that's in the offing. This kind of thing is left us in a terrible position, Glenn. We have no easy way to turn, and so we just continue to count the dead, and the dead continue to mount in terms of numbers. Europeans are beginning to get a sense of it, but they still haven't been told the truth. Very recently, I'm sure you're aware that the MI6 and CIA got together and cooked up this ridiculous notion that 315,000 Russians had been killed. It's laughable nonsense. Based on this big lie that at the beginning the Russians were incompetent and stupid and the Ukrainians just had a field day and killed them all. Well, that was never really true. It's not true today. At some point, we have to put an end to it. And Europeans have to come to terms with reality. But Europeans seem to be very, very wedded to the mainstream media. I mean, I'm sure if you and others, and your friends on the Duran, they stand up and speak, and buckets of filth and abuse are poured all over them as Russian agents. Now, I don't see much evidence for the Russian agency, but nevertheless, this is the problem. And the people that control finance, the people that control the media, and the people that control our governments are the same people. This is very tribal. These individuals are all part of the same class, and they all share the same goals. And what we think, or what is in the interests of us as Europeans or people anywhere, simply don't matter. These are ideologues in the worst sense of the word, and they're up against a foe that cannot be defeated. And what I mean by that is that if you look at Russia, and it's a nationalist state, which is one of the reasons that the globalist class wants to destroy it, because they have been working to denationalize us, to denationalize Norway, denationalize Germany, denationalize France, erase the history or revise it to conform to some Marxist narrative that makes absolutely no sense and is irrelevant. And this sort of Marxist worldview is losing. It's been losing from the beginning, but has never really worked. And I see something similar happening in the Middle East, because what's rising now is not widespread support for Israel. Israel's support is dropping through the cellar for obvious reasons. But if you look at the region is a boiling cauldron of what I would call ethno-religious nationalism. People are rediscovering that they are all Muslims, whether they are Arabs, Turks, or Persians, whether they are Shiite or Sunni. Everyone in Russia's national consciousness and identity has been strengthened by the war, far, far more so than our identity is irrelevant. We haven't fought. You and I and the rest of the West, we are not engaged in the fighting. The fighting has been done exclusively by the poor Ukrainians who thought they were fighting something they aren't and thought they were fighting for something they don't have. In other words, the notions of liberal democracy, there's nothing remotely liberal or democratic about this man Zelensky and his horrible regime. He has much more in common with Leon Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. But we don't seem to see that. We are not getting that because the media and finance and the government rest comfortably in the hands of the same elites. Now, I don't think they're going to be able to conceal it too much longer, but I'm amazed that they've gotten away with it this long. Very shortly, I think we're going to see developments in the Middle East that are going to make it even worse for us in the West in connection with all of these forces.
Yeah. Arestovich, the former advisor to Zelensky, which you mentioned, he actually came out with a statement suggesting that, well, not suggesting, explicitly stating that Ukraine had bet on the wrong horse, that they had put themselves in the globalist class when from what they're seeing, the ability to mobilize, passionate support and well, the future effectively lie among the states who have leaned more on the nation states. So it's interesting he would point that out, but it does seem now that the economy is going through a hardship. They don't have the same access to weapons. They can't get enough manpower. I mean, they're mobilizing women now and minors and everything, but this translates into very unreliable forces. So you have more people surrendering, more people withdrawing, and and I'm just curious. Everyone seems now to acknowledge that either it's stalemate or more realistically, Ukraine is losing. So everyone's reporting on this every day. They're losing more territory, and their situation becoming worse. So uh, I don't understand completely the situation in Washington now. Once strategic territory is lost, and there's no way to reverse it. This is not the time you want to sit down and talk. I know the Russians recently suggested that. They've given up on talking to Washington. They will demand capitulation from now on. But is there no one in Washington really pushing for a negotiated settlement, given that no one really has any vision for any success on the battlefield?
Well, there are some people that advocate a negotiated end and some form of settlement with Russia, but they're a very small minority. I mean, I can count them on one hand. You've got someone like Senator Tuberville from Alabama, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, probably Mike Lee from Utah. That's just the Senate. I imagine that you have perhaps 40, maybe 50 members of the House that feel that way. But those numbers are minuscule and they shrink to insignificance next to the numbers that are effectively on the globalist payroll. You have to understand that the last 30 years of what I would call crusading ideology of regime change and forcible conversion to some mythological liberal democracy has been very rewarding financially for the people in power. It has been, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, everybody blames it on the Department of Defense and blames it on the so-called military industrial congressional complex. Obviously, that's part of it, but there's more to it than that. Remember that the beast, this military industrial congressional complex, wants to be fed, but it's still agnostic about how it's fed. There's nobody over there saying, well, we got to destroy everybody in Ukraine. In fact, right now they could care less about Ukraine. They've made all their money. They're shifting their attention to the Middle East and trying to figure out how they can benefit from the war in the Middle East involving Israel, because our support to this point for Israel has been unconditional. Doesn't make any difference what Israel does. We support Israel. Well, that's very lucrative for the Department of Defense and its military industrial supporters. That's not going to change. So the short answer to your question is I see no evidence for a readiness to negotiate an end to anything anywhere at the moment. Now that could change depending upon the setbacks in the Middle East in particular, and I think those are coming. In fact, I think they've already begun because this small state of Israel has bitten off a huge chunk of its problem and is now choking on that chunk, and that's called Gaza. And Gaza, of course, is a modest feature of the problem in Israeli geostrategic landscape. Hezbollah to the north of Israel makes Hamas look like the volunteer fire department. So, I mean, and then you have the entire region that is now coalescing, as I pointed out, in this ethno-nationalist environment. And I think that's that's a combination that cannot be beaten. Same thing is true in Russia. Mr. Putin will have to make a decision at some point. He'll have to say, look, we've waited long enough. We'll just march to the Dnieper, and he may have to actually go into Kiev to make his point. He has understandably held back from that because he has resisted successfully this stereotype nonsense that all Russia wants to do is conquer, invade and conquer. He doesn't want to do that. That's patently obvious. We think we are leaving him no choice, and we may be right. We're forcing him, goading him, if you will, just as we did to get him into eastern Ukraine, to go further. And he may have to, just to make his point. But I do think things in Europe are changing. When I look at the Olaf Scholz regime, it seems to me that that's on very fragile ground. I don't think Mr. Macron in Paris is in a strong position by any means. Quite the opposite. France, if anything, is on the verge of a civil war, has been now for a few years. Who knows when that will break into the open? When I listen to the regime in Berlin talk about, well, we have to spend more money on defense to get ready for war with Russia, I burst out laughing because I don't think very many astute Germans believe that at all. I do think he's worried about protecting himself and his regime. I think the globalists, uh, the sort of neoconservative globalist Trotskyites, are in one important way very similar to Islamists. Once the Islamist wins the election, which is always the goal, to win democratically if you can do it, the Islamist is permanently in power. Well, you have a similar phenomenon in the West with the neoconservative globalist Trotskyites. Once they've gotten themselves into power, and they are in power at the moment, they have no intention of ever relinquishing it. This is sort of also similar to the Soviet bloc. Once a country has become communist, it must remain communist or Sovietized in perpetuity. That was Brezhnev's argument in 1968. Well, this is kind of the same thing, only now we're talking about this strange neocon globalist Trotskyitism or Trotskyism. You're now part of this nameless amorphous mass. We've converted all of you to globalist citizens, people with no name, no identity, no purpose, no religion, no culture. You're living in this giant consumer-driven system, consumption machine. We're feeding you, we're clothing you, we're directing you, and you should love it because it's in your best interest. And we're never ever giving this up. I mean, that's the problem right now that you face and that we face inside the United States.
Yeah, well, in terms of the reaching a settlement, it's quite extraordinary that even as Ukraine's losing, we still don't even warm up to negotiations by talking about neutrality. I noticed it's become quite extreme in that sense that we're only increasing the rhetoric. But I want to return very quickly to Israel because you previously mentioned you think this is going to spiral out of control and into a regional war, and it seems like we have two pathways now. One being the possibility of the U.S. and Israel going after Lebanon. And the second now appears to be possibly Yemen, as Yemen is, well, the Houthis, Yemenites are attacking the shipping lanes in the Red Sea. How likely do you see any of these wars taking place, or is it possible to contain it?
Well, I don't think I said it was inevitable it would spiral out of control, but I think it's very likely to do so. I think it's likely to become a regional conflict. Well, the region is very complex. Egypt is perhaps a keystone in the edifice of the security architecture that we erected in 1973 that has persisted for 50 years, and it is in danger of falling apart. Now, what do I mean by that? Sisi, who has a nation of tens of millions, I don't even know what the current population figures are for Egypt, but back in the 1970s, it was a little over 40 million. Today, I think it's closing in on 100 million. And this population is enraged at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Sisi is widely viewed inside his own country as an Israeli slash American puppet because he's refused to take any action. We talk a great deal about leveling Gaza. We forget that Sisi leveled the city of Rafah, which is just on the other side of the border from Gaza. I mean, leveled it. Really, we watched it go on in 2015. Part of this was connected to the larger war on Islamism in the Sinai because you had ISIS or ISIS chapters and other ISIS-like elements uh, spontaneously rising in the Sinai. And the Egyptians committed their own military power to deal with it because it was also naturally, in their eyes, bound up with criminality, smuggling and corruption and so forth. Rafah was leveled with a goal in mind of making it impossible for anyone to gain a foothold in Gaza, or excuse me, in Sinai. And at the same time, he and his fellow elites viewed the people in Gaza as a catalyst for trouble. In other words, we don't want them because they'll just bring the war with Israel to Egypt. And we can't afford them. We have too many people as it is. We haven't got the infrastructure for them. We destroyed Rafah. There's nothing out there. So, we can't deal with this. Well, the tide has turned now. And you have, as I said before, this ethno-religious nationalism where people in Egypt are saying, wait a minute, these are Muslims like us. They're being exterminated. They're being driven like animals into the desert. How can we stand by and do nothing? And Sisi has walked this tightrope for a long time, but now he has to ask himself every morning, who among my senior military leaders is going to remove me on the grounds that Egypt must join the fight against Israel? This is a real concern. You have a different set of circumstances, but similar in some ways in Jordan, where the king of Jordan has always been a very close, strong, reliable friend, certainly since the 70s in the United States and the United Kingdom. He has a population that is overwhelmingly Palestinian. It is no longer even half and half. It used to be majority Bedouin and related, or at least connected to him in terms of loyalty and so forth. That's no longer the case. The Palestinians in Jordan are also enraged. They're seeing what's happening on the West Bank. We don't cover the West Bank, but there's a lot of violence in the West Bank, violence committed on both sides and specifically by settlers against the Arabs that live there. And of course, the government is encouraging what I would call preemptive strikes. In other words, it's almost in the same realm as Stalin's notion of prophylactic defense, kill the citizen before he has a chance to commit a crime. Well, in some respects, that's happening on the West Bank. And then we move over to Syria. Syria is comatose. Syria is a zombie. It's not recovered from this terrible civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or driven out of their homes. Assad wants to survive, and his enemy has historically been Mr. Erdogan, because Mr. Erdogan has been only too happy to support all the radical Islamist elements. He'll never admit it publicly, but he and his intelligence officers were very, very, very important players in the stand-up of ISIS. That was supposed to attack Shiites, only it became Frankenstein's monster and attacked in every direction against everybody. And now he is backed off from that because he realizes he has a greater and more powerful enemy, and that enemy is in Israel, to the point where he's now willing to talk to the Iranians, which is something he's never done before. So those are the situations north. When you go down into the Arabian Peninsula, and you look at the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. The Emirates are at risk, and so's the House of Saud, because their populations are equally enraged at what is happening in Gaza. Now the Houthis step forward, and the Houthis have now begun interfering with commercial shipping traffic for all the reasons that they're Shiite Arabs and they want to demonstrate their commonality of purpose and ethnic nationalism with the people of Gaza. And we are answering this by saying, well, see, this is Iran provoking this, just as Iran is provoking Hezbollah, Iran is provoking the Shiite militias in Iraq and so forth. No, it's not really true. Iran has worked tirelessly to stay out of the fight. The Iranians want nothing to do with the war right now. And these Shiite Arab militias, if you want to call them that. They're acting on their national identity. What is that? Well, they are Arabs and Muslims. And so they are going to act one way or another against the West. Iran has to maintain good relations with them. They want to keep them on side, but they're not necessarily pushing them because right now Iran and Saudi Arabia continue to hammer out agreements that are in both of their interests. So Iran really doesn't want this war to break out in a way that would destroy all the work that's being done by Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China to bring some measure of stability and peace to the region. And remember, the Chinese depend very heavily on the Persian Gulf, the oil and the gas, as well as food coming in from Africa. So they're not interested in a war in the region. And that brings you then around to Mr. Erdogan. Well, if you walk around Istanbul right now, there are signs all over the city about Israel, the apartheid state, Israel, the criminal state, the Israelis, war criminals. The population in Turkey is enraged. So Mr. Erdogan, who is being very comfortable posturing as what I would call a neo-Ottoman nationalist, now suddenly has a tiger in his tank, so to say. He's got a tiger that he's holding on to it. And at some point, he's going to have to decide what to do with the tiger because he doesn't want the tiger to eat him. So I think I would say that all of these regimes, to one extent or another, are all riding their own version of a tiger. And they're trying to figure out how to keep the tiger from getting out of control. I think the tiger is going to get out of control. Because you're talking about feudal states in terms of political development and modernization in the peninsula and the Persian Gulf. And all of those places, the leadership can be very rapidly replaced by new leadership. I mean, relatives may step forward and say, I'll lead the crusade. At some point, they're all going to be driven to that outcome. And then here we sit, and we remain Israel's only real friend. And we're sitting offshore, and we're prepared to help them. I mean, we've flown and shipped in enormous quantities of ammunition and weapons, technology the Israelis need. And we're saying, please, please try not to kill civilians. And the numbers of civilians keep dying in greater and greater numbers. I mean, the increase is unending. So we want this to end, but we're paralyzed because Mr. Netanyahu and his supporters in the United States have purchased the Senate and the House and the White House. And they have powerful backers, billionaires who have provided plenty of money for a long period of time to ensure that the United States will provide unconditional support to Israel. So what's going to happen here in the United States, I think, is that there's going to be a groundswell of people, mostly younger people, that are going to step up. It may end up looking like 69, 70, 71 in the United States during the Vietnam War, where people say, no more. We will not be a party to this. But the people on the Hill are still very comfortable receiving their benefits from supporting Israel unconditionally. So anybody who says, what happens next? We look at that puzzle. Now, if we attack the Houthis have made it clear they will destroy the oil refineries and the oil drilling platforms all over Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And people say, oh, well, that can't be done. No, it can be done. These are all very vulnerable installations. You don't even need to destroy all of them. If you destroy a portion, you're going to make a huge dent in the economic stability of the West and potentially China. And the Saudis are the ones now, even though they have been blood enemies of the Houthis, saying, please, please, don't push the Houthis. We don't want this. We want to get on with Iran. We want to get on with the rest of the world. And if you push the Houthis, it could destabilize us. Yeah, it could very definitely destabilize Saudi Arabia. We don't know which match is going to be lit and tossed into the powder room where all the gunpowder is stored. But there are a lot of matches out there, and several of them have already been lighted. It's a question of which one is tossed into the gunpowder storage facility and blows everything up. I think it's coming. And it's going to be enormous when it happens. And again, the rest of the world, Europeans, they don't like the Muslim problem, if you will. They've got their own Muslims to deal with, but at the same time, they're not ready to go commit for Israel because they're not going to support what Israel wants to do in Gaza. On the American side, we're paralyzed. We're not leading. We have no strategy. We have no sense of limitation. Again, what are the limits on American power? We continue to pretend that there are none. But I think we've already demonstrated the limits of American power in Ukraine. And we're going to see these limits emerge even more starkly in the Middle East. So anything is possible, Glenn, but I think it will take a few more months for this to come together and coalesce in a way that becomes extremely dangerous. And I see no one trying to stop it.
It's quite extraordinary because I remember Richard Nixon making the point, yes, United States and Israel will always be close, but it's also in the US interest to have a certain relationship with Arab states, such as Egypt. But it appears that the US is, by signing up fully to Israel's war, it appears that they're willing to sacrifice a lot of these, well, all of the relationships in the whole region. So that's what I wanted to ask as well. Is there any wider discourse these days about the direction of America? Because, well, 30 years ago, after the Cold War, that's when Washington began to build this, well, new world order, which has been referred to as liberal hegemony. So there would be one center of power. The world would unite behind the United States, and liberal values, which manifested itself in NATO expansion and all of this. But so at the same time, the main foreign policy objectives of our states, such as Russia and China, was, of course, to develop friendly ties with the US. So again, much reason for optimism. But if we forward 30 years, we see now that countries like Russia and China are aligning themselves against the US, primarily because of the hegemonic ambitions. So we see Europe not looking great, the United States losing its influence in the Middle East, possibly, yeah, the whole region could go on fire. And adding to this, of course, there's this very alarming economic, social, and political upheavals within the US. So I was just, given the putting all of these issues together, is there anything being discussed these days in Washington? Anyone has their pulse on the nation in terms of looking at the wider picture, rethinking the role of the United States in the world? Anyone want to pull back and recover economically, socially, instead of continuing to run an empire?
If you view the United States of America as a patient lying on the table, and after the patient has been examined, the physician says, you need a heart transplant. And then a series of other physicians walk in and say, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. There's nothing wrong with the heart. We'll just give the patient a haircut and a shave, and he'll be fine. That's where we are. Everyone wants to give us a haircut and a shave. No one wants to admit that the heart itself, the heart of America, is in great danger. And we need either a transplant, I think we need a transplant, or some very serious heart medicine. The heart medicine probably isn't going to come. So I think we're going to have a heart attack first. And then somebody will say, guess we were wrong. We're going to have major surgery. That's what I keep trying to tell people in Europe. I've told my friends in Israel this. I've told everyone who will listen. That's the problem in the United States. You think that we are perpetually powerful. You think that nothing has changed since 1991. You think the American brand is invulnerable, invincible forever. You're wrong. It never has been. It isn't now. And Americans are beginning to figure out they need a transplant. But still, too many Americans are really watching football and trying to find out what's happened in Taylor Swift's love life. I mean, literally. Sometimes people talk about bread and circuses in ancient Rome. Well, if we are in any way like the Romans, we're very absorbed with our attention, at any rate, is absorbed by bread and circuses. That's our problem. Now, that won't last because I think we're headed into very difficult financial times. I've long expected our financial system to implode. But again, no one believes that. It doesn't matter. If you talk to Nassim Taleb, if you haven't interviewed him, you should. And he will talk about the looming Armageddon. He will tell you that there's a pond out there with lots of black swans. They're all going to take off. Which one goes first is anybody's guess, but it's going to happen. talk to Alistair MacLeod, who writes prolifically on the same subject and talks about the Russians very cleverly going increasingly in the direction of gold-backed currency and bringing China, India, and eventually the BRICS into that system. We can't do that for various reasons. That would destroy our monetary system. Even though we've effectively destroyed it ourselves, we can't go to the gold-backed approach. So I don't know what we're going to do in the West. But the point is, if you take those people on one side and you look at the realities, we can't recruit for the armed forces, not because Americans don't want to fight, but why would you, as an American citizen, want to join the United States Army if someone stood up and said, well, we'll just bring in all these illegals over here that just walked over the border a few months ago and they'll sign up. We'll put them in the U.S. Army. That's what people are hearing and seeing. Suddenly Americans look at the Army and it's full of foreigners. These are faces that they've never seen before. They're wondering, how the hell did they get there? Suddenly your recruiting base, the people you depend upon who fought all your wars, a lot of people like me, are saying, no, thanks. I don't want to be in that organization. It's not just because of the stupidity and failures of the last 21 years. There have been serious demographic changes in this country. So you put all of that together, we'll inevitably get a heart transplant, but I think the patient is going to have a serious heart attack first. It's coming. And you can already see the outlines of it. Even the dumbest people on the Hill have figured out we can't afford Ukraine anymore. Of course, the amount of money we save by dumping Ukraine is minuscule. It's not going to divert us off the path of crisis and disaster. And now we need to focus on Israel. Well, why should we back Israel in this operation of collective punishment that the world has condemned as mass murder and expulsion of a population? Well, we need to support it. You know, the Israelis are good. The people they're dealing with are bad. Well, what do you mean bad? Well, they're anti-Israeli, like everybody else in the region, right? So you say to these people, well, why are you doing this? It all boils down to money. It's financially rewarding. It cannot be rationalized in any other way. Now, Richard Nixon, in that interview that you're talking about, said, well, with the end of the Cold War, the rationale for our strategic partnership with Israel, vanished for all intents and purposes. And then Ted Koppel, who is Jewish, obviously, said, well, then why are we still behaving as though nothing has changed? Well, it's because we see Israel as this morally righteous state, the legacy of the Holocaust. It deserves to exist and so forth. That was my generation's view. That's my view. But how do you reconcile that view with what is happening in Gaza? And people that are younger are saying, we don't think so. This is morality. This is the morally upright Israel. This is what we should support. Clearly, that's not going to work. If anything, I would say we are beginning to see the end of America's special relationship with Israel. This war is going to kill it. It's not going to survive. That, of course, presumes that Washington will do nothing. Stand by and watch it all burn down. It's been my personal experience over the last 30 years that's what we do. We watch it all burn down. We pack our bags, get on the planes, get on the ships, and come home. We change the subject. Only it's going to be very hard to change the subject this time because things at home are not good.
No, I agree. I think after Ukraine and current war, there might be huge shifts coming to U.S. relationships to both Europe and Israel. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so I'm just going to have to thank you again for your time and hope to have you on here some other time. Thanks
Well,
again.
Glenn, I wish you and everyone in Norway a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Oh, yeah, Merry Christmas.
I know that Norwegians know how to celebrate, so I've always appreciated that, and I wish you all the best.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye.